Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to Daraja Press and to our discussion today on this extraordinary book, Fanon Today, Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth, edited by Nigel Gibson. We have a great lineup of guests joining us today. So let me introduce our guests. Perhaps we'll start with Eugene Reid. As a black worker, he came into the world in 1955, he tells us, the year of the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama, his birth state. Living under the trauma of Southern state rights of segregation up until Alabama was forced to integrate in 1968. For about 25 years, he was a member of the Marxist Humanist Group, News and Letters, and wrote articles for the newspaper around his activities on the black and labor struggles, including police violence within the community. Our second guest is Lou Turner, who is well known to us here on Daraja Press on previous discussions that we've had with him and Nigel. Lou is a clinical assistant professor, Department of Urban and Regional Planning, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, UUIUC, and former academic advisor for the Department of African American Studies in 2008-2017. He is co-author of Frantz Fanon's Soweto and the American Black Thought, and circulated in the anti-apartheid underground of the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa. Welcome to Eugene and to you, Lou. We have also Levi Gahman, works at the University of Liverpool and is an affiliate with the University of West Indies. Prior to Liverpool, Levi lived in the Circum-Caribbean for half a decade, where he taught the wretched of the earth. He is also author of Land, God, and Guns, Settler Colonialism and Masculinity. And our next guest is Johannah-Rae Reyes, is an intersectional feminist activist with a degree in geography from the University of West Indies. She currently works with the Trinidad-based organization Womantra. Her practice centers on race, class, gender, and disability. She intentionally writes on political issues faced by the marginalized communities across the Caribbean. A warm welcome to you also, Joanna and Levi. We were expecting to have Toussaint Lossier, who's an assistant professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of African American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Unfortunately, he's got caught up on flight problems. So unfortunately, we won't have him here today, but we promise that we will drag him into the studio in the coming weeks to enjoy further discussions. And our moderator and perhaps interrogator is the editor of Fanon Today, and many of you will already know Nigel Gibson. He's an activist and scholar specializing in the work of the Algerian revolutionary Frantz Fanon. He's author of many books, including Fanon, The Post-Colonial Imagination, which won the 2009 Caribbean Philosophy Association Frantz Fanon Outstanding Book Award and was translated into Arabic in 2013. And also the really important book, which I gather is no longer available in South Africa, but it's the Fanonian Practices in South Africa, from Steve Biko to Abashari Basmanjondolo. He teaches at Emerson College, Boston, USA, and is honorary professor in the humanities unit at the University of, currently known as Rhodes University in South Africa, in Grahamstown. So a very warm welcome to you all, and to you, Nigel. Let me pass the baton on to you to ask our panelists to introduce what they wrote about in the book.
Thank you, Feroz. And first of all, thank you for, as the publisher of this book, for all your work in putting it together. It certainly has been for all of us, I think, a kind of labor of love, and for Daraja Press to be involved in it really connects to the necessity of the book for current activism. I mean, it's conceived around the idea of the importance of Fanon's thought to contemporary activism, and it's not conceived, as a book to be read, and though it certainly could be a book to be read in seminar rooms. The idea of the book, and I love the cover of the book. It reminds me of the famous American edition. You may remember this edition.
Yes.
The one that sold, over 1 million copies. Masses in Motion on the front cover. Very different from the way, if one wants to do a comparative analysis of the covers of The Wretched of the Earth. Very different from the contemporary version. There's no masses in motion. There's no figures in orange and black, and we caught that in a certain sense in this book, The Reason and Revolt of The Wretched of the Earth. That, to have action, in other words, people in action, that sort of connects with the idea of Fanon's thought and the reason of the book. In other words, the revolt and reason, the thinking of those connected to Fanon's thought and the way in which Fanon can become alive to movements, mass movements in the contemporary world. This is not to say that Fanon's thought is directly applicable. It has to be recreated, but in a certain way, that's really what we're talking about today. So rather than me going on, the book has. Let me introduce the idea of the book. It has 3 sections. The first is Fanonian militants. The second is still Fanon. And the third is Fanonian practices. And the idea of these meetings was to have one meeting on each section. Unfortunately, the idea didn't necessarily come to pass because for 2 reasons. One, people dropped out or just couldn't make it, like Toussaint today. And so at the moment, we just have 2 meetings, and today's meeting will be essays from, or chapters from, the first section, Fanonian militants, Jean's chapter, Levi and Johannah-Rae's chapter, and then the chapter from Lou Turner and Curtis Kelly, which is in the Fanonian practices section 3. So, with that being said, let me just introduce everyone. And I didn't really say what order we were going to have. So I thought maybe we should start off with the historical, the historical chapter, which is Lou Turner and Curtis Kelly's chapter. And let him discuss, introduce his chapter for about 10 or 12 minutes. And then we'll move on to the two chapters from the first section, Fanonian militants. So, with that being said, I'm hoping I'm not putting Lou Turner on the spot. But I'd very much like to hear from Lou Turner.
Thank you, Nigel. And, wouldn't be the first time you put me on the spot. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about what I think is a really great book. The cover is outstanding, and the material inside the book is really outstanding across the board. The thing that I would emphasize in talking a little bit about the history of Fanonianism in the United States, and a little bit about Fanon's own history, which we try to deal with in our chapter. So it's not just the reception of Fanon in the Black Power movement, excuse me, in the United States, but also what Fanon drew from and was influenced by in the Black struggle in the United States, which frankly has not been seriously engaged in Fanonian scholarship, unfortunately. But in doing so, I'd like to speak to what I think you mentioned as the spirit of the book, Fanon Today, and that is activism. Have a brief quote from Fanon in the last that begins or heads the last section of our essay, and it says, and it's one of these great quotes from Fanon, is from Wretched of the Earth. They use it often, and I think it's important to keep it in mind, not only as concept but as principle of the social movement today, of the revolutions that have come and gone and come again. And Fanon says in Wretched of the Earth, everything can be explained to the people on the single condition that you really want them to understand. And as simple as that is, and almost self-evident as that is, Fanon had to say that in the context of writing Wretched of the Earth, in the context of what was unfolding as the beginning of the post-colonial moment, as they say, what happens after the revolution. Because all kinds of mystification and ideological obfuscation was taking place within the nationalist movement, within the colonial movement, that was it was clear that the intellectuals, the leadership, didn't really want the people, the masses of people, to understand. So when we wrote, John Allen and I wrote Frantz Fanon, Soweto, and American Black Thought, which is a Marxist humanist text of Fanon, on Fanon, in response to what was happening in the United States in the post-civil rights era, but also what had emerged as we began to write that pamphlet. We made sure it was a pamphlet and not a thick academic tome or something, was in South Africa, the Black consciousness movement, and discovering that Steve Biko and his comrades in the Black consciousness movement were reading and circulating Fanon's work within the underground. So the idea of writing that work, Frantz Fanon, Soweto, and American Black Thought, was as an activist piece, something that would engage directly the social movements of the time in the United States and in Africa. So I see this text as continuing that tradition. In fact, we, on the cover of our pamphlet, we had masses in motion as well, because we thought that they are really the people, they were really the subjects of revolution that Fanon was writing to and writing for. So that was very important to us. Our text looks at the fact that in Fanon's, in the reception of Fanon's work, the African-American struggle, the Black liberation struggle in the United States, was the first, the largest, and the most, I believe, consequential home of Frantz Fanon. When Wretched of the Earth was published originally in 1961 in French, President Charles de Gaulle of France had it banned. So I think only 3,000 copies in French ever circulated. But it really was with the English translation, and I think now is an even book on Fanonian translations of Fanon's work, because the question of translation has been so central to globalizing Fanon as an influence across many struggles. And so the question of translation was very important. And in the 1965 translation, and particularly the publication, the Grove Press publication of Wretched of the Earth, really came at a time when there was the schisms that were opening up within the civil rights movement, particularly as pushed by Black students and youth activists, and the emergence of the Black Power movement. And ultimately, organizations like SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and ultimately the Black Panther Party, all seized on Fanon's work and, so to speak, ran with it. So our piece looks at how various sectors of the Black liberation movement during the period of Black Power received Fanon's work, developed it, its influence in their way of thinking, particularly amongst various figures within the Black Panther Party and in and outside of the Black Panther Party, everyone from Eldridge Cleaver to James Foreman to the various other members of the Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement, to George Jackson, Soledad brother who was in prison, and on. Some of the things that we weren't able to get in because it was a pretty long piece, unfortunately, were some of the very important figures in Black feminism within the movement at that time. So that Tony Katie Bambara has an interesting piece and take on Frantz Fanon, not on Wretched of the Earth, interestingly enough, but on Dying Colonialism, a text that is not discussed enough of Fanon's, particularly the famous chapter 1 of Dying Colonialism, Algeria Unveiled. And Tony Katie Bambara, who edited arguably the first Black feminist text called Black Woman, talks about the influence of Fanon's work amongst Black feminists in the period of the Black Power movement as well. So there's so much in the African-American experience, political experience, the social movement within the United States that engages Black people, that Fanon became very, very important. We look at some of the theoretical and ideological issues that the Black Power movement drew from Fanon, such as the concept of the internal colonialism thesis, that the Black community is an internal colony, what George Jackson called the Black colony within the United States, various aspects of Black nationalism and the limits of Black nationalism that Fanon talks about in Wretched of the Earth, or talks about if nationalism isn't turned into concerns or social consciousness, into socialism, then it ends up into humanism. It ends up in a blind alley. So he's looking at right within the decolonization movement, the anti-colonial movement in Africa, the limitations of those movements, particularly with the challenges of that come with independence, which he was very critical of, and was one of the first to point to neo-colonialism as a new stage that had to be struggled against. And of course, we kind of know what happened with that, unfortunately. So there's, I think the one important thing, my last point that we have in this essay that I hadn't really examined before, but my co-author is a graduate student in history, Curtis Kelly, was very engaged in uncovering Pan-Africanism in Fanon's work, and particularly how the Pan-Africanist conferences that were held beginning with the independence of Ghana and onward, and that Fanon had attended 5 or 6 of these of Pan-African conferences of one kind or another, and how the issues of violence and nonviolence in the anti-colonial movement began to be debated and threshed out in these Pan-African settings, these Pan-African spaces, is something that I think is also new, that Fanon's famous concept and theorization of violence really emerges within the context of these Pan-African conferences in Africa. And that we also attempt to make the argument that it's that stage of Pan-Africanism, which certainly has a longer history than the 1950s and early 60s, was also very influential in the kind of influence that Fanon's thought, his ideas, started to wield within the Black Power movement as well. So that's a new aspect of some of the work that this essay attempts to do, that was, I think, important for this moment, quite frankly, when Fanon, as we said in Frantz Fanon's Soweto and American Black Thought, is a world revolutionary. And we're trying to kind of return to and trying to unpack some of that in this essay as well.
About how we were going to do this, but I think the best thing to do is everyone have their notes ready to engage in questions after each has spoken, rather than engaging immediately after each individual. So with that being said, I'd like to turn the floor over to Johannah-Rae and Levi to speak about their essay, which takes us right to the contemporary moment and engaging Fanon specifically in the contemporary.
Hi, good day, everybody. Yeah, I mean, our chapter, kind of centered around a particular moment, like one of the many moments in Trinidad and Tobago's history where the tumultuous relationship between civilians and the police kind of came to a boiling point. Because, from since colonization, emancipation, independence, the relationship with the police has been, it's not been a positive one, and the state has been using the police to control and essentially oppress people. So our chapter talks about the this incident where a police officer was murdered in the morning. So that was June 27th. And then in the afternoon, 3 men were on their way to the corner store to buy rum. It was one of their birthdays. And on the way there, they were in the car and they were, stopped by police officers. And, there was a shootout, which was the initial narrative that, that was put forth in the media. And all 3 of them were murdered. And thereafter, there was CCTV footage that was circulated on social media that showed that, it was not a shootout. And there was no kind of visual evidence of there being, a gun on any of these 3 men or them shooting at the police. So it's interesting how this whole problem, of police violence manifested, and then social media got involved. And then there was also, the moment, because just a few weeks before, in Trinidad and Tobago, a number of organizations would have hosted a solidarity action in front of the US Embassy when George Floyd, was murdered. So it's kind of like, it's almost a spiritual, magical situation where, that would have happened early in July. And then at the end of July, we're having our own, encounter, with police violence in a very big way, where it comes to a boiling point and people were really, just upset and at their wit's end. And, and it became bigger, than anyone could have, imagined at that time. And while I work for a feminist organization with Mantra, and we engage in feminist work, so that's why I was snapping when Lou was talking about the first chapter of Dying Colonialism, because when I read that chapter, I was like, the connect, I was like, Fanon, oh my gosh, it's just everything, all encompassing, and it's just such a rich chapter that I connected to as a woman. And yeah, we all saw the news, me and the other members of my team, and we immediately started to, got on WhatsApp with each other to try to figure out, well, how do we mobilize, what to do, because the situation was giving very chapter 2, wretched of the earth, grandeur and weakness of spontaneity. So it's very unwieldy. And there wasn't necessarily like leaders particularly emerging in the situation. And the media did not help at all in terms of, repeating a very old trope, of these people who come from neglected communities as violent, as chaotic, as uncontrollable, and aggressive. And I mean, the situation was very complex, and the media at that point in time did not do a good job of deconstructing the complexity in a way that was holistic and wholesome, and that could bring us, to a point of reflection. And so it's all of these things happening. And while Levi and I, we're friends, I was one of his students at UE, and so I was talking to him on WhatsApp. So we were WhatsApping about it, and I was kind of like using him as a soundboard almost to kind of rationalize and think through like possible actions. So, I mean, there were a number of things that we would have done as the organization in Trinidad and Tobago, where we would have gone to the communities to try to see how we could help, talk to our, fellow activists there to see what we could do to mobilize. But in the conversation, we, had similar, ideas in terms of, well, our analysis. So that is what happened, essentially. That's how this chapter started. It started from a place of, this is the situation that's happening, what can we do? And I mean, Fanon, used writing, as a way to contribute to register and share his analysis. And Colin Robinson, who is the foremost LGBTQ activist and is now an ancestor, talked about writing as an arsenal and writing as a tool of testimony. So it's kind of thinking through all of these things and developing our approach. So, we began, writing, we began talking to community members and collecting stories and putting together this, our analysis and sharing an alternative, reflection on the situation that, kind of fixes the mess, that the local Trinidad and Tobago media would have made, in the hopes that in the future, whether near or distant, that there is this, piece that kind of provides, what I would deem a more holistic, analysis of the situation. So it was just like a very natural progression. I think we started writing before we even knew where this was gonna go, and things just kind of fell into place at the time. So yeah, Levi, I don't know if you want to jump in and share, your side.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks, Johannah. I think to reiterate what Johannah was saying is that effectively, amidst this state-sanctioned violence as well as the police brutality, Johannah is grounded in local communities and wanted to go about figuring out a way how to intervene into the persistent, what we would sort of refer to as the persistent coloniality of the Trinidad and Tobago police force. And if you excavate the genealogy of the police force in Trinidad and Tobago, and Johannah, you can jump in if I'm out of time and on any of this stuff, is that you'll see a through line historically that it's been a repressive institution with a particular mandate to suppress or keep in check, quote unquote, uncivilized, wretched others. And with the chapter, Johannah and I were effectively sort of saying, how do we put writing at the service of some sort of emancipatory politics or praxis? And Johannah's grounded and engaged with local communities, and then went about engaging with dozens of people from the local community. And I think it's not insignificant to note the spatial dimension of what was taking place in Trinidad and Tobago, in that the killings that took place of the 3 men happened in Mova, which has been labeled a hotspot community in Trinidad and Tobago. So it's a site, quote unquote, where criminals live, as well as in two, if you look at the vernacular of the Commissioner of Police in Trinidad and Tobago, he'll often refer to criminals, quote unquote, as cockroaches. And so this parlance, or a vernacular of subhuman species and wretched others that live in a ongoing colonial context in which race and class become socio-spatialized, as well as then too, criminal others or aliens or cockroaches, to draw upon the language of the state, needs to be policed, needs to be patrolled, needs to be monitored, surveilled, and then also too, needs to be ended if they step out of line with any given set of bourgeois respectability politics, or violate any sort of common sense notion of what is acceptable behavior, or even what is acceptable in terms of existing in a post-colonial reality. And then two, another key thing I know Johannah was concerned with was recognizing the political agency as well as critical consciousness of community members. And so in the chapter, we very much tried to amplify as well as draw upon the voices of community members. What was their diagnosis of the police killings? And then two, subsequently in the aftermath of those police killings, there were mass uprisings across Trinidad with respect to speaking out against state-sanctioned violence as well as police brutality, in which a young woman, a mother named Ornella Greaves, was also shot and killed at a demonstration when she was responding to state-sanctioned violence. So it was effectively the degree to which people were responding to state abandonment as well as alienation, and saying, in a very Zapatista sense, ya basta, enough, we're not going to take this anymore. And in the chapter, local folks would also sort of say, this is our George Floyd moment. So the roots and rhizomes of anti-colonial resistance that are connecting communities and struggles across geographies is one thing that I think very much resonated in that local context, but also too in the discussions that Johannah and I were having about how do we, in any way we can, put ourselves at the service of communities in struggle, as well as use writing as a form of intervention with respect to state-sponsored violence that continues oftentimes, as well as then too, as Johannah was mentioning, is justified through particular types of discourses which frame certain people, oftentimes based upon axes of class and race, as subhuman, as criminal, or in this case as cockroaches, in which it is legitimate violence to end their lives from a particular status perspective. And so capturing the socio-spatial dimension of race, class, and I would also, as Johannah alluded to as well, the race, class, and gender dynamics of any given post-colonial reality is something that we were both concerned with, as well as then too, a credit to Johannah, she was the one engaged with communities. That it was taking place during COVID, as well as the pandemic, also factored in to the way that the state was cracking down upon different activists, as well as demonstrations against the state. Johannah could elaborate upon that a bit more, maybe in the question and answer session, because I know we might be going over time here, but capturing that socio-spatial dimension of the race, class, and gender dynamics of state violence in a post-colonial Caribbean context. As well as then too, I think it's very critical doing the best we can to recognize the political agency, as well as the ability of people from communities in struggle that are targeted read the reality in a very Freirean sense, and understanding that we're not necessarily best positioned to read their reality, but they are, and we're trying to capture that with the chapter. And so I'll end there.
Thank you, Levi and Johannah. I just wanted to read the title of your chapter and then put it in context of where it is in part 1 of this book. It's the 7th chapter. Is it? No, it's the 5th chapter. It's the 5th chapter of the book. It's called From Caliban to Cockroaches, the Construction of Profane Space, Wretched Others, and Political Agency in a Post-Colonial Ghetto. The preceding chapters, 3rd and 4th chapter, you can see this these chapters speaking to each other. The 3rd chapter is Toussaint Lozier's chapter, which Toussaint, as we mentioned earlier, was going to make it, unfortunately couldn't make it today. His chapters are called Setting Afoot a New People, Prison Intellectuals, New African Communism, and the Making of Meditations on Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. That's Sales's book, Meditations on Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. And then the 4th chapter is by Wangui Kimari, Looking for Justice in a Compartmentalized World, Mothers and Police Killings in Kenya. So again, that speaks directly to police killings in Trinidad. And the 7th, and the chapter after Johannah-Rae and Levi's chapter is by Spusa Kode from South Africa. The power of Abathlali and our living politic has been built with our blood. In other words, talking about, again, about the state cracking down, literally the state killing of activists in South Africa. And so you can see how these chapters are speaking to each other across the world, and bringing Fanon. So the specificity of the situation, what Fanon will call the need for situational analysis, of being grounded in specific situations and specific spaces, then becoming a jumping off point to be able to speak to others in what might seem similar post-colonial situations and spaces. The book starts off with a chapter from Flavio Zenon Almada, who's talking about the lived experience in a Lisbon ghetto, and again, of course, speaking about police violence and also his own coming to consciousness by reading Black Skin, White Masks. And so, and then the 2nd chapter is Gene Reed's Black Mind in Motion. So I want to now move over to Gene and have him speak about his chapter.
You're on mute, Gene.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the introduction, Nigel. And it's a pleasure to be here with dedicated revolutionaries around the concepts of Fanon. I had to make some notes. I wrote a few things down, but I just start out with I know when you introduced me, Farad, you mentioned News and Letters. I'm not presently a member of News and Letters. It's been probably almost 20 years since I was a member of News and Letters, but I would say that Fanon, I had read Fanon probably in 74. I met News and Letters in 79. And they were the only group at that time that was dealing with Frantz Fanon in particular, which was basically an invitation for me to join. And I read it through Lou Turner's book and John Allen's book, Frantz Fanon, Soweto and American Black Thought. So it's a part of my history, but that was also a big chunk of that has to be in relationship to Runge, who was the founder of Marxist humanism in the United States. And I think that is key because there was a relationship between that and philosophy, Hegelian philosophy, which made Fanon's writings, I think, a little bit clearer for me to understand, because you had to have that base of philosophy, which no other group was basically dealing with at that time because of the language. The language is was so new to me and unique when I read Fanon, but it kind of clarified a lot of the concepts Fanon was working on. And I had to kind of write some stuff down because I wasn't trying to make this, trying to make some points explicit, I guess. I think we can see Frantz Fanon as a presence today. Fanon's writings are permanent writings because he makes his thought subjective to his experience, reflected in the Black experience as consciousness. And until history surpasses him in Black thought, action will be, in other words, you need action. In other words, without that Black thought, you will be marking time. We lose our place in history. With this cloud of depression sitting over the country today that clouds people's minds, with the plague of COVID and the ex-president Trump's ever-present lies, his lies as an attack upon thought, is part of the battle for the minds of mankind, which has stressed out all of society into a need for a good psychiatrist. Because of this stress, a psychiatrist like a Fanon. What did Fanon see anew? Not only to help his patients, who he attempted to patch up and put back into society as a whole person, but Fanon realized to just patch up the patient was a lost cause, because the real need was to change white colonial society, which butchered their lives, the lives of the colonialized Blacks. Fanon is very relevant for a confrontation today in revolutionary thought against the powers that be, the state of capitalism as we know it today, a feudal form of capitalism, slavery that enchained the body into labor, the worst form of forced labor, slavery. Black lives on slave plantations over 100 years ago still permeate our thinking, where the culture of African identity was stolen. This has created an alienated existence for American Blacks. While the system shouts, "get over it," that's the past, but that past has a ghostly presence in our consciousness today. The abolishment of slavery in 1865, which took a slave rebellion to a civil war that divided a nation before slavery was abolished. I see, or should I say, we see Fanon as relevant due to his confrontation with white colonialism. He saw Black consciousness as a force that can empower masses of people, not as an abstraction, but in concrete activity which has yet to be realized for our day. For myself, the importance of Fanon lies within the identity of self-movement, i.e. Black mind in motion as mass movement for freedom, where we as a people don't assimilate in life, or more like assimilate in thought into a white world of acceptable conservative thought to be viewed as established success, where the white picket fence, the house on the hill, to sell out what you are as being Black into something which you are not, the white man, as Fanon saw it, would never accept our Blackness, which is not an attack upon white people as a whole, because as even Fanon recognized that whites were as also tortured souls in need of reaching their human side. The rebellious Blacks were reaching to become, quote unquote, a man or a woman, a whole person, while both groups are reaching to become whole human beings. You can look to the past George Floyd protests, where we saw as many, if not more, whites out in protest over police killings than Blacks. During the civil rights movement during the 60s, the trash workers strike in Memphis this is the same strike where a few days later Martin Luther King was killed. This picketing for better wages and work conditions with picket signs that stated, quote unquote, "I am a man." The civil rights movement led to the Black Power movement, while both were incomplete, but gave the masses some breathing room. While the movement was suppressed from outside and inside, the movement by petty got truncated into petty bourgeois concepts, implementing, in other words, blacks were promoted into political office. The black face was there, but the consciousness of blackness was missing. It's like the cover of Black Skin, White Mask, which caught my attention right away when I first saw it in '74. It's that image is what we got after the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement in a certain sense. We got blacks with white faces. But Fanon speaks to this danger in his chapter, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness Found in the Wretched. Being black and a manual worker as a teen in the early 70s, growing up in the Deep South, with that image being a quote unquote, as being black and a worker, you are a failure due to pre-imposed racist images of everything negative within society being black and poor. I found a kinship with Fanon when I reached Los Angeles in 1974. Within Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, I found myself, which was using a Herman Melville term related to my being, to look in the mirror as a shock of recognition. That was an awakening. In other words, you see yourself anew of who you are after you read Fanon. As this awakening, in other words, being black and a worker could be also empowering. Black Skin, White Mask led a trail to the wretched of the earth for me. Once again, quote, this is from Wretched of the Earth, page 309. Once again, the objective of the native who fights against himself is to bring about the end of domination, but he ought equally to pay attention to the liquidation of all the untruths implanted in his being by oppression. The need being to turn that self-hate of negative energy, which is so prevalent in the black community, that negative energy needs to be turned into a revolutionary force. Black consciousness as a force and reason that can transform reality. Black thought comes before the act for the needed transformation of black reality. And that was just some of the things I was thinking about in relationship to this session today. And I think it's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done. And hopefully this will not be just an end in itself, but also like a new beginning in relationship to Fanon.
Thank you, Gene. I don't think the cover of Black Skin, White Masks, like the cover of The Wretched of the Earth, is the same one today, sadly. But people can find it, images of it, if they don't have that particular 1967 edition.
Yeah.
I don't know whether anyone. I'd like to open the floor up to questions. For a dialogue between the chapter authors, if you'd like. I think it's fascinating to me that we have two quotes from The Wretched of the Earth. One by Lou, which was about everything can be explained to the people on the condition that you want them to understand, and the second from Gene about the kind of I didn't write it down, the liquidation of internalized negative self-hate, which comes from the fifth chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, and how this, and in a certain way, how Fanon is being thought about today. Of course, there's much, everyone is talking about Fanon, right? There's a wonderful element to that, that there are, for example, Richard Pithouse in South Africa sent me 2 articles today about Fanon. One was in Jacobin, and the other one was in Catalyst. I'm not going to make a critique of the articles. I'm just saying everyone's talking about Fanon, and it's wonderful in a certain sense that we now have, you know, with the translations of Fanon's literary and psychiatric texts, everything now is available in English as much as we have, but that doesn't mean that the interpreters are necessarily speaking and explaining to the people what Fanon is saying. There's an enormous amount of one could say, verbiage written about Fanon. And I think by grounding, you know, by returning to this notion of grounding Fanon in thinking about, as Levi and Johannah spoke about, how to intervene, recognizing that there is thought going on in the community, and having one's ears open to that thought going on connects in a certain way to what Fanon was saying. Not that Fanon is arguing that one's uncritical of that, but one had to first of all listen closely to what was being said, as one can get from, for example, a dying colonialism, his analysis of the revolution, of the Algerian Revolution, his analysis of Algeria unveiled, meant that he had to be open to new elements. So I think that's another thing about the reason and rationality of The Wretched of the Earth. The title's taken from the end few pages. If you only want to read a few pages, read the last few pages of the second chapter of The Wretched of the Earth on spontaneity, and the third chapter of The Wretched of the Earth on the pitfalls of national consciousness. And you see that the challenge is to the immediate challenge to, and this is and he's writing this in 1961, the immediate challenge to the independence movements that are being carried out at that moment, is their inability or their distrust of the people, and their inability to acknowledge any rationality in the revolt. So it meant a completely different kind of frame of reference for thinking about revolt, right? And the other thing I wanted to mention, and I'm glad Lou mentioned the discussion about violence, because I was just reading, for example, Robert Young's introduction to the Fanon's plays in Alienation and Freedom. I was reading this a couple of days ago. Sadly, I still haven't read the plays. I suppose the fact that Fanon wanted to burn these plays has always meant that, you know, I don't know how much to read into them. However, what Young does in his introduction is staggering to me, because he basically says that Fanon's plays can be read as in a parallel, his words, with his psychiatric writings, and that is that he sees the plays as creating a shock, in the same way as he sees shock therapy as important to Fanon's psychiatric work. Now, of course, I would disagree with reducing Fanon psychiatric work to shock therapy, but the whole point of Young's introduction is to emphasize the question of violence. Now, this opens up a large issue, right, in Fanon, because of course Fanon sees violence as absolutely essential getting rid of colonialism. Colonialism is a violent regime. Post-colonialism is a violent regime. We see it in LA, we see it in Trinidad and Tobago, we see it in Kenya, we see it in South Africa, and on and on and on. Violence, police violence. And so this raises the question of how can we think about Fanon's conception of violence, you know, in the contemporary situation? And what I think Lou Turner does in his chapter, which I think is fascinating to me, is he talks about Fanon's 1958 speech, which created a stir at the moment, because it's a speech where the dominant thinking and the leadership, Ghana, Nkrumah, was non-violence, and then Fanon speaks about the necessity of violence, and then his concern, which I think is really a concern that he addresses in most forcefully in the Pitfalls of National Consciousness chapter, the question of what happens after independence, and his concern about the murders of Lumumba on one hand, who supported non-violence, and Abani in Algeria, who supported violence. And I can't remember the exact words. Sorry, I didn't do my homework for this meeting, so I haven't actually got the text in front of me because I don't have the book yet. I only have the PDF, which of course you could search. But the fact, I think Lou says something about that. In fact, the question of violence or non-violence these two disparate people, Lumumba and Abani, as leaders as revolutionary leaders, that wasn't the key point. Wasn't about violence and non-violence. Can't remember exactly what Lou said, but anyway, so this is an opportunity. I don't know whether you want to take it up, of anyone to discuss the question of violence and counter-violence, of where we can think about Fanon within these specific situations, and of course, the enormous situation of state violence, whether that's in LA or in Durban or in Trinidad and Tobago and so on, and how we can think about Fanon's thinking about violence in the contemporary situation. Of course, this might put everyone on the spot, but I'm going to stop now. Sorry, Feroz.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to build on this. I mean, the problem is that the Pitfalls of National Consciousness really deals with this problem of this nascent bourgeoisie and its attitude. But what it sidesteps, and which I think Cabral is much more focused upon, is to say, look, in every case we have seen the taking over of the existing colonial state. You cannot expect an institution which is built on not just forging violence, but creating this large space, the sacrificial zones, which allows it to carry out that kind of fight. It's a continuity of what happened under colonialism. In other words, there is no structural functional change between pre-independence and after independence. It's a continuity. And to me, that seems to be the great failure. That's one of the issues that we have to debate. What needs to be done to overhaul? Cabral said, burn it down to the ground, start again, create alternative organs of people's power. it isn't that there's a white administrator, it's that we have an administrator at all. And I would really like to have perspectives of the panelists on this question of the state, because it's not enough to talk about post-colonialism. It is neo-colonialism. It's a continuity of the same forces, albeit now decked out in the national flag. It doesn't change the function of that and its relationship to capital.
Well, if I might, since I've been I've been invoked, the Fanon-Cabral relationship has been around for some time, and people see a continuity between the two. Others see a discontinuity between the two. That Cabral, kind of builds on Fanon or goes places where Fanon didn't go. Clearly, they occupied similar, but frankly, historically different spaces. Fanon is writing out of the process of decolonization, where national movements and national independence was coming into being. And as we know, Portugal was kind of the Portuguese colonies was kind of the second phase of the liberation struggle. Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and whatnot. And frankly, they went more deeply, in my view, in terms of national liberation. I guess I would still have to say, then, why do they all still end up pretty much in the same place, in my view, with some minor differences? So it may be that these questions that you're raising, Feroz, are really, really difficult. I know I was on a different talk few months back, and I brought up the question of this beautiful discussion that Fanon has about the importance of village assemblies, a direct democracy. And he kind of pushes back against the petty bourgeoisie, the administrators, the technocrats who just want to get planning done, want to get this done. And he defends a process that goes through the people. He wasn't looking for efficiency. He says, if it takes longer to do it along the lines of bringing everyone in the community up together, you will actually have greater efficiency because you'll have more buy-in and the thing will be executed more quickly. But in the first part, yes, it will take much longer to do. So rather than the civil engineers coming in and figuring out everything, or the planners coming in and figuring out everything, he says it has to be organic to the people and how they organize and structure their own lives. And even if it takes longer to do it, it will take on the other end, on the back end, quicker, because you'll have everyone now engaged. And I think I see the similarity between Fanon and Cabral on that. Though I think there are obvious historical and even some theoretical discontinuities between the two, I guess I would begin any analysis at looking for these kinds of threads that connect them and whatnot at first. Just lastly, I'd want to say, because I don't want to hog up, that what Johannah and Levi presented brings up another area of Fanon studies I think is important to do, and that's Fanonian geographies. I mean, Fanon lays out the geography of colonial society and the colonial state. And quite frankly, there hasn't been much done on that by Fanon scholars on Fanonian geographies. And the geography, the way he does it is just so beautiful, so dialectical, because the importance of chapter 1 and laying out the colony, the geography of the colony, was because he talks about the nodal points and the nodal lines along which the resistance would appear, the resistance would arise. And so unless if you don't know the map, baby, you ain't in the game. If you don't know the geography, he's saying you're just not in the game. And so I'm hopeful that the kind of stuff that the work that Johannah and Levi will do will really extend to that. Also in chapter 3, all the stuff he has on the police, he has a lot on the police, the colonial police in chapter 1. In chapter 3, he talks about the neo-colonial police. Okay, that the neo-colonial police are really an extension of the party, the Nationalist Party. And so there's just so much to unpack there. Fanon is in the streets, man. He's looking at you from, murals. He's looking, he's just all over the place. And that thing about breathing, with the George Floyd and the Eric Garner thing that I can't breathe, and which brought out all these memes about Fanon, we don't revolt because for any particular culture, but simply because we cannot breathe. And that comes from black skin, white mask. He continues it in Dying Colonialism in the chapter on Algeria Unveiled on women. Here he flips the script. He talks about combat breathing. And it's in the chapter on women as revolutionaries. And so there's breathing in some other areas as well. But it's a trope that's very important because of the kind of physicality that he sees, the trauma that he sees that colonialism and racism really insinuates into the very sinews of people, the tensity, the tonicity of muscle, the stress, the trauma. And that's coming all over the place. When you heard those young people in the George Floyd trial talk about the guilt they felt, they were off screen. They couldn't show them because they were children. They talked about the guilt, the collective guilt, individual and collective guilt, all of them, whether they were young or whether they were old, that they felt in not being able to do something. And Fanon writes about that profoundly, about this collective guilt that people feel in the face of brutality. And you kind of wonder, well, in Trinidad and Tobago, what was the feeling of the community in the face of that kind of brutality? And here Fanon is discussing, he even discusses when George Floyd is calling for his mother, as he's narrating essentially his own death, and he's calling for his mother. Fanon has this beautiful thing about why is it that we call for our mothers in times of distress and trauma? He just unpacks this shit. It's incredible. And so Fanon is in the streets, and I think this text puts him is out there in the street where he is, because Fanon has been too much in academia for far too damn long. And frankly, I can't even say that the Fanon industry, academic industry, has really shed much light on things. It's actually in the context of revolution that Fanon's work comes alive, and that we see things that are new and that can give us some direction. But I really want to engage. I think you raised a very important thing. I really want to engage on the Fanon Cabral thing. I think you're right. I think that's where we got to go.
I'd love to hear from Johannah and Levi about the experience of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah, we just have been talking a lot, and I'm just having like all of these connections, and then it's just like to hold them in, for like the opportune time to share. And in terms of the question that Lou would have asked about, the community and their feelings, and then also a little bit of what Eugene would have shared or, reflected upon in terms of Black thought and Black action, and there being a kind of, logical, trajectory or journey from thinking to acting, and doing. in talking to, residents of MOVA, there was a lot of, anger, and then there was a lot of sadness, and and a feeling of being misunderstood. And I feel like, if there was this active listening being done to these community members, I don't think that, our Prime Minister or our Minister of National Security would have had the gall to say that, whatever protests that would have happened in 20 plus communities across our country, Trinidad and Tobago, would have, been able to say that this was something that was orchestrated and there was some sinister plot to destabilize the country. Because, I would have spoken to, a mother who would have been a friend of the three men, neighbors. They would have been neighbors. And she was talking about, how much of a role they played, in her son's life, because his father wasn't around. So he had these three father figures who would look out for him and make sure, everything was okay when he was playing in the street and stuff like that. So when, people come out and say, well, the police too wicked, or, this person was a good boy, they're not taking into consideration the fullness of the human being that they're just kind of referring to cockroaches or, pests in the street because of their alleged or assumed involvement in criminal activity. There's also not a sense that this involvement in criminal activity or, is a response to the violence that has been, levied against these communities and the neglect that has been levied against them. Because another resident was talking about, the involvement with marijuana and other narcotics being an industry and being kind of their industry in terms of being able to make money, being able to make a livelihood for themselves. And then another resident would have talked about, well, we actually also have, a food strip. We have ice cream shops. We have a place where you get really good wings. And as a community, a lot of us make the decision to go and buy there. This is us rationalizing the way that outside communities see us and how they marginalize us. They're not going to hire us. They're not going to allow us in their school. So they're like, okay, well, we'll have our own thing here. We're going to have our own homework center. And I think if anybody would have gone and, spoken to them, had a conversation and listened, they would know that a lot of the narratives that are being parroted by the politicians, by the media, by, people on Facebook, are inaccurate. They're inaccurate. And there's also a sense that these people hate the police. Almost everybody said, well, I actually have a family member who's a police officer and I don't want him to die, and, there's a sense that this hatred is something that's so like divisive, but it's actually way more complex than that. It's like, well, actually, y'all are killing us. And then at the same time, the economy is trying to kill us and starve us. And something has to give, at some point. So it's very complex listening, thought, action that's happening in the communities. And if we listen, we would see it. And, that's kind of some of the work that I've been trying to do with the organizations I've been working with. I've been trying to see and, uplift and help.
I was thinking on that, what you guys were talking about as far as characterizing criminals as cockroaches. I mean, I think that's how the systems try to avoid the human element of a condition that people live under. They want to make us into things, whether we're workers or blacks in the community, criminals, whatever they want to call it. But it's not, if they thingify you, it dehumanizes you. And that's part of the attack upon the mind, as well as the complacentness of white society and accepting his deaths like a George Floyd, as he must have been, why didn't he stop moving or whatever? It's like a rationalization. But thinking about colonialism and neo-colonialism, it's almost like trying to get beyond bourgeois thought. If you have a revolution, say, in one country, or you try to make communism in one country, it's like almost impossible because the world economy just, it's like it puts a rope around your neck. It'll strangle that system out. If you want to get beyond neo-colonialism, it's almost like it has to be a world phenomenon. It has to happen in a world sense, because it's that bourgeois thought that we have to get beyond, which we're having difficulty getting out of. And when we talk about violence, I mean, I think violence was very much part of the civil rights movement, even though it wasn't a philosophy of the civil rights movement. The Black Panthers, the Black Power movement, I mean, it was what people wanted. I mean, I know when I was a child, we went to meetings as a child at my mother's knee. You know what I'm saying? Where they were talking about we would have to protest, walk, and, you know, to try to overcome segregation or to integrate in the South. But there was a few brothers in the crowd that say, I'm not going to be spit on. I'm not going to be kicked. I'm not going for that. So they couldn't participate in those protests because they knew they would bring the violence of the state down on, you know, the police force, and some people would die. So that philosophy, in some ways, what was it? What did it accomplish, or what did not accomplish? So really, the idea, the civil rights movement had an idea that took on life, a moment in history that became historic because it changed our condition. In a sense, it wasn't completed. But when you say violence against the state, you have to be talking about masses of people. The only thing that can stop the power of the state, because they have the power. They got the bomb, they got all the weapons. But if they can lose, if we can take back the minds of humanity, then we can win. You know, it's not so much we have to have more weapons, even though you need to defend yourself. But to take back the minds of humanity would transcend the conditions more so than the weapons, I think.
I think that's a wonderful point, and I, if I could find it, I'd read a quote from Fanon, which is at the conclusion of the fifth chapter of The Wretched of the Earth. The chance of me finding it, though, are very, very slim. So
I feel like if you just open the book and just pick a thing, it will be there. That's it.
Yes,
it'll be a winning quote. Any quote from Fanon is a winning quote.
Well, to dovetail onto what Jean was saying, I like Fanon's quote that the political education of the masses has become a historical necessity. And it seems like that's the pathway out of the violence of the state, whether it be a Westminster modeled liberal state in a post-colonial context or a white supremacist state in an active white settler colonial context, is the ways in which we, and I agree with Emile Cabral's statement that the secret to the failure in any, I think, post-colonial or even active colonial setting, the secret to the failure is the state. And it seems like Fanon was very much advocating for a radical departure from hierarchical, authoritarian, anti-democratic governance structures at the end of The Wretched of the Earth, and breathing life into new ways of doing things, or like the Gemma that he talked about, where we can work through decisions. It will take as long as it takes, like Lou was alluding to, as well as then too, there will be tensions and disagreements, and we can work through those via humor and being human with each other, socially reproducing each other in ways outside of capitalist logics and social relations.
You know, I think this thing about education, you know, perhaps it's us who need educating, in the sense that, I mean, I think your chapter is one very good example, and I think it's repeated throughout the book, that it's when you listen to the actual experiences of the wretched of the earth, les damnés de la terre, that we begin to understand that perspective and what the hopes, visions, and possibilities can manifest themselves. And I think far too long, there has been a tendency to say, we're the ones who know and must impart. where it's more dialectical in that listening allows us to understand and provoke and help that thinking. It's extraordinary about it's a consistent thing throughout this book. Every chapter speaks to that, the need to listen, the need to hear those voices. And there's some extraordinary descriptions throughout the book. And I think one of the reviewers of the book wrote, this is a wonderful book. It takes Fanonian dialectical categories beyond their original subjective context into concrete political practices, combining the necessary experiences of particular struggles with the conceptions of universal freedom. This is a militant work for militant readers. And I think that really captures what this book is about.
I couldn't say it any better.
Nigel, it is, a great tribute to you to have brought such minds together and to approach in that same mode rather than just an eclectic collection of what people might have to say about Fanon. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, big up on yourself. Like, I felt so honored to be a part of this book, because I mean, reading Fanon, his books and stuff, you're just like, oh my gosh, I wish I could meet him, or I wish I could, have some kind of connection to, him as a person. And then I felt through this process of contributing to the edited collection that this is my connection, thank you so much for that. And this is great work.
Yeah. So we're approaching now a very short discussion. This could go on all day. I wish it could, but it's about 1 hour, 22 minutes. And I think that we should respect our participants as well. But I would really like to thank all of you for finding time to participate in which I hope will be only the first of a whole series of discussions about Fanon and the building of a universalist humanism in the future and today. Yeah. Nigel, final comments.
Well, thank you, Feroz, for hosting this. Thank you, participants, for participating, and also, of course, writing your chapters. And Feroz, don't forget to advertise our next meeting, which is happening on Tuesday. And with that, I'll sign off.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I hope you will listen in on that discussion. And I think we will plan further ones. If you have suggestions about things, issues, angles that we ought to take on, then please do get back to me. So once again, thank you for your contribution to this extraordinary book. And tell everyone about it. It's important. I think it's a really, really important piece, and I'm very, very proud to be associated with publishing it. So wishing you all well. Take care. La luta continua. Please don't translate that as the Kenyans do, which is the looting continues. Okay.
All right.
We'll end the broadcast now. I think we have one more comment from Uganda. Asante sana, comrades. Thank you for the insightful discussion.
All right.
Please don't leave. I will end the broadcast and we can have a final word together.